sustainability claims are going through this massive evolution in the context of sustainability systems. So you can imagine that historically with SAN and previously when SAN was part of Rainforest Alliance, a lot of claims work was about logo on product. And that was really where consumers saw the claim. It was where all the attention was focused in managing the claims. But the definition of sustainability claims is really about a much broader set of opportunities. It's about promotional communication about sustainability attributes of a product, process, service, or business. And you can see in that the communications part can happen in many different ways. So in a text claim, there are key or core elements that need to be included that basically give context for what is this claim about, and how do I know it's legitimate? And we'll go into some of those in detail. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there are, in fact, a wide range of claims that companies need to make or want to make. And I say need to make because in the context of regulations that we're going to be talking about today, there are obligations being set for companies to communicate, particularly around things like their own due diligence or the way in which they manage certain issues, whether that's climate or deforestation or nature. So of course, we still have certification claims, but we also have obligations or voluntary commitments by companies to report and disclose on their performance or the performance in their supply chain. We have companies wanting to talk a lot more about specific issues. So talking about their scope 3 emission reductions, if you're familiar with the climate space, or their nature targets, or even their livelihoods and living income commitments and progress. So you get everything from regulatory requirements that say you need to report this in this way to companies wanting to talk about what they're doing, to talk about the commitments they're making or the actions they're taking, or ultimately the impacts that they're having on the ground. Next slide. So just a couple of examples here. This one from Living Wages. So when we talk about companies wanting to make performance claims, it is kind of on a temporal spectrum where even as they are investing in actions like they would do with the Sustainable Agriculture Network, they want to talk about the commitments they're making. This is what we hope to achieve. And then when the actions are happening, they want to say, this is the things that we're supporting or the things that we're doing. So those are the actions. And then they want to talk about the results. And that's really the crux, the hardest part is what data do they need? How can we ensure that they are talking credibly about the impacts, particularly if those impacts are not directly or only related to the actions they took or the funding they provided. And so you get into these really tricky scenarios of trying to manage for what types of claims do we allow companies or other stakeholders to make. And I think that's a big question for many sustainability systems. Next slide. And just one more on the impacts claims piece. As I mentioned in the first slide, it is very much about providing the information that the user customer needs in order to have confidence in the content of the claim. And so when we're talking about impact claims, I'm not going to go through these, but these are just the kinds of things that are important to include in a text claim. So, things like when did the action take place and what was the result of that action? What type of information do customers need about the sourcing region or any partnerships with whom you were implementing this activity. So it's just background information. This is drawn from one of our existing claims guides. Next slide. And so just to give you a bit of context, and I'll just open this up and then Meriam will talk through in a lot more detail about the policy implications, and I'll come back and talk about our claims guide a little bit more. But hopefully you're all familiar. If you're not, great references for credible practices in ISEAL's credibility principles. First of all, just 10 principles that define those core values for credible and effective sustainability systems, and then our code of good practice, which was revised last year or published last year, the revised version that draws together good practices across the whole sustainability system, including for the claims space. Next slide. And so when we think about a sustainability system, it is usually constituted by a set of core components, of which a standard or set of performance requirements is at the base of that. And then there's some means of assurance or verification against those requirements, monitoring of performance, and then ultimately the claims piece. And so the claims are very much the sum of what the system has behind it. So if you imagine there are many different ways that a sustainability system can be implemented, those will affect the types of claims that you can have confidence in enabling customers or stakeholders to make. Next slide. And I mentioned the ISEAL code has claims components within it. There's a whole section on claims. These are essentially the 8 criteria. Again, I'm not going to go into them in detail. You will get a set of slides with the recording. But I think one of the things to highlight is that it is the scheme owner, in this case, the SAN, to responsibility to define what types of claims they will allow their customers and their clients to make, and to have the systems in place to control for the use of those claims. So making sure that there is some kind of approval process, as well as checking that users are making claims correctly when they're actually implementing those claims or making those claims in their annual reports or in their reporting and disclosure surveys. That's something where the scheme owner has to have responsibility for making sure that the way your scheme essentially is being communicated is valid and credible, because that's the critical piece of the way that many stakeholders interact with your system is they see those claims. So it's a really critical part of the overall implementation of a sustainability system. Next slide. And I think this is my last slide. One of the pieces that we did way back when we developed the first version of our claims good practice guide was something that was more user oriented, and it's very simple way of talking about what makes a credible green claim. And it's 5 components. The claim needs to be clear, it needs to be accurate, and it needs to be relevant. And then it needs to be backed up by a system that is transparent and robust. So clear, it needs to be easily understood by the user or by the customer. Accurate, it needs to represent the actual performance on the ground. Relevant, it needs to be about the issues that are important. So you can't be highlighting the really good things that are happening over here, like in soil practices, while let's say there's massive water pollution or deforestation and biodiversity loss. And a system that is transparent, obviously that's fairly self-evident, and robust. the ISEAL code, again, is a really good reference of what a robust system is. And that's basically saying, okay, so not only are we making the claims, but we've got a system behind us that ensures that what we say is accurate and true.
Thanks, Patrick, for the presentation. This section will be mainly about the EU anti-greenwashing law and what are the EU policymakers waiting from us. So we've all heard about scandals of big business and big brands that contributed to greenwashing. So it's not only focused in the EU. However, in the past years, there was a growing concern in the EU over misleading environmental claims and greenwashing practices. So the EU Commission conducted a research to consumers, basically, and that revealed critical results, what you can see in the gray box. For example, more than half of green claims give misleading information, and half of all green labels lack of a robust system behind them. So to address greenwashing, protect consumers and provide better information while purchasing, the EU proposed two significant legislation as the beginning of the end to greenwashing in the EU. So we have the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition that we often call Empowering Consumer Directive and the Green Claims Directive. So they both have common objective. Make sure there is no mismatch between what companies say they do and what they are really doing on the ground. So these two, in the coming slides, I will be presenting these two legislation separately. Next slide, please. So we start with the Empowering Consumer Directive. It has been already adopted by the EU institution, and the transposition is expected by March next year. For those who are not familiar with the EU policy, for the EU laws and EU jargon, transposition is actually when the legislation is transposed from EU to member state level. And here we speak about directive, so the transposition is a little bit more critical. The Empowering Consumer Directive applies to all goods in the EU market, so product, part of product or service, and has no restrictive scope. It's important to note that even if it's a new legislation, it doesn't come from out of the blue. So it amends already two existing legislation, being the Unfair Commercial Practices and the Consumers' Rights Directives. This Empowering Consumer Directive clearly prohibits the use of generic claims and increases the focus on transparency, information disclosure, and on product longevity and reparability, and prohibits the use of sustainability labels and claims which are not backed by certification scheme. Next slide, please. So this slide shows how claims should look like under Empowering Consumer Directive. So as I said, this directive prohibits the use of general environmental generic claims that lack of proof, that are broad or that have like big statements that are not clear. Like, for example, sustainable soil management practices could also be conscious agriculture, sustainable or responsible agricultural practices, etc. Those are no longer acceptable. So instead, there are two solutions here, or to provide specific clear claims in a way that is transparent. Example, instead of sustainable soil practice, the correct claim would be regenerative soil management practice with like cover cropping or low tillage or whatsoever that enhance soil health and carbon sequestration. The second solution would be to keep use the generic claims, but ensure that that recognized excellent environmental performance can be demonstrated. Unfortunately, at this level, the definition of what is recognized excellent environmental performance is not provided yet. And next slide, please. So what does this directive bring? It provides new definition of sustainability labels, generic environmental claims. So sustainability labels is any voluntary trust mark, quality mark or equivalent, either public or private, with reference to its environmental and or social aspects. And the generic environmental claims means any environmental claim made in written form or orally, and includes also all social media aspects that are not included in the sustainability label. Next slide, please. Yeah, so on the top of the stated definition, this Empowering Consumer Directive prohibits the display of sustainability labels and claims not based on certification scheme, as I said, and therefore it provides a list of criteria for sustainability for a certification system. So first, it defines certification system to be a third-party verification scheme, that this certification system allows for use of sustainability labels, that the certification scheme is transparent, inclusive in terms of stakeholders' engagement. The certification scheme has clear procedures for dealing with all non-compliances found. And finally, that the assessment is carried out by a competent authority and independent third party. Next slide, please. Yeah, so before digging into the Green Claims Directive, I would say that the key takeaways of Empowering Consumer Directive would be that it has been already adopted, will soon be implemented, no generic claims for all products, part of product or service, unless showing excellent performance. And third point would be that they need specific, clear, transparent wordings. And last thing should be backed by certification systems. So these are the main points to have from Empowering Consumer Directive. Now, the second legislation, which is the Green Claims Directive. This slide is also to give you a general overview of its state of play. So unlike the Empowering Consumer Directive, this is not adopted yet. As you can see in the arrow here, all blue circles refer to steps that have been already achieved, which are basically the adoption of the text. Again, for those who are not familiar with the EU lawmaking, the Commission has already proposed the text, and then each of the co-legislators, meaning the Council and the Parliament, agreed separately on a bunch of amendments and adopted separately their position. This brings us to the green circle in the arrow that is shown on the screen. And so now the three institutions are going through trialogue meetings to basically focus on a final text. We still don't know when the final text will be adopted and released, but likely by end of Q2 2025. So it's important to note that this directive will apply to all voluntary environmental labels and explicit environmental claims that are made by traders operating on the EU market, and that there will be some exemption. So it will not apply to claims that are already covered by existing EU laws, like the EU organic label and also the eco labels. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this directive comes with clear objectives, and this slide describes the objectives and how to reach them. So three main objectives: make environmental claims reliable, comparable, and verifiable across all EU, protect EU consumers from and companies from greenwashing, and improve the environmental performance of product and service in the EU. How this will be done? The EU is setting a minimum requirement for substantiation, so equivalent to justification and proof, communication, but also verification of voluntary environmental claims and labeling. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this directive provides detailed rules on the... yes, next, could you please click more? Because I... okay. It's okay. So there is some animations that we now see, but it's okay. So this directive provides detailed rules on and brings a lot of definitions, like for environmental claims, of explicit environmental claims and environmental labels. It also defines rules for substantiation of explicit environmental claims, what you see here in purple. So you can keep, yeah. So on the top of that, There are also rules on the substantiation, communication of environmental claims, but also requirement on the credibility of environmental labeling scheme, requirements on verification and certification, also requirement on the communication, where trader is required to communicate explicit environmental claims, covering truthful and clear information. Also, this directive highlights requirements for the verifiers. I will not provide a lot of detail under each point at this stage because a lot is still unclear. As I said, it's not adopted yet, so I'm leaving it a little bit more general. Please, next slide. Yeah, so what is still missing? It's important at this level to note that ISEAL has been following this directive since the drafting process. So since even before the small circles that I showed in the arrow. So we've been exchanging with policymakers on this purpose. We've provided a lot of position papers, a lot of recommendation, bringing years of experience on the role of credible sustainability system, but also how to make credible claims, as Patrick already presented. So what we think is still missing is some clarity and details on approval procedure and requirements for the green claims verifiers. We lack a little bit of alignment between the two directives, as they are seeking both to be complementary. So the Green Claims Directive comes to complement what is lacking on the Empowering Consumer Directive, and we are really looking forward to have all these unanswered questions once the text is published. And it's also very important for us to ensure that the implementation body would have the capacity to support this directive and to support reach the objective of this directive. Next slide, please. I hope I still have some time, but well, I think that it's important also to have a look on the next steps to consider that the changes and news brought by these two directives are to be considered together, where the Green Claims Directive is more specific. It's also very important to consider the communication of labels and claims on the product surface and how to give access to this requirement to consumer, because these directives are meant for consumers these are B2C regulation, I would say. And finally, to consider using credible sustainability system to support claims, to have at the end credible claims on every product and service. Next slide, and I think that's the last one, yes. So to conclude for this presentation, I would say that the EU anti-greenwashing laws present a challenge to all stakeholders. They would need to adjust their practices on claims and get rid of misleading claims that lack proof, just to avoid greenwashing. So stakeholders would also need to resist to greenwashing, to not stay silent on all sustainability efforts that are making on the ground. So the key finding is a middle ground, making clear, verifiable claims, adopting good practice, and working with credible certification system to ensure transparency without legal or reputational risks. And yeah, and here it's just to invite you to listen to ISEAL podcast on making green claims credible if you would like to have further information on EU anti-greenwashing law and how good claims making helps regulate meaningful sustainability actions. And yes, that's it. Back to you, Patrick.
And really, I just have 4 quick slides here to talk about the claims good practice guide. Please do think about if you have any questions, anything you'd like to discuss or learn more about. We will have quite a bit of time to get into a good discussion. So just to note that our work on credible claims has been going for 10 years now. The original Sustainability Claims Good Practice Guide was published in 2015. But because of this interest in claims and the diversification of different types of claims, we put out other guidance around landscape action, around living wage. We're looking at living income right now, as well as supporting some of our members to develop claims guides around other specific issues, including regenerative agriculture. Next slide. And so what we see is with the new or the revised structure of the Claims Good Practice Guide, it is very much a how-to manual. It's here are all the things you need to consider when you're putting a claims system together and implementing it. So obviously you need to first understand what types of claims are you allowing users to make, defining the rules for how they can use those claims, and then implementing the system itself. So issuing claims, ensuring that there's adequate monitoring and enforcement of correct use of those claims, and then ultimately a system review, just making sure that your claims remain relevant over time. So very logical, very straightforward. There are a few changes, improvements, hopefully, in this revised Claims Good Practice Guide. Things that really help to reflect the changing landscape of claims. So expanding the scope of the typology of claims, much like what we've been talking about here, reflecting some of the developments in legal regulations. What we don't do in the Claims Good Practice Guide is say, based on regulations, you need to do this or you can't do that. But rather, here are the core principles that will help to align your claims practices with emerging legislation, because as Meriam mentioned, some of it is not yet finalized, and there's obviously going to be more regulations going forward. And I think one of the points we haven't talked about that's worth noting is around this data management system. You know, ISEAL is a big advocate that sustainability systems have good data management in place. And ideally, those are not isolated. You don't manage your claims data separate from your monitoring data, for example. And so really seeing how we can have better data management to enable and be in a good position to allow sustainability or users to make sustainability claims about that data. And then more detail on the monitoring side. And then last slide, just to give you a sense of the timeline, we are just finalizing the first draft of the revised claims guide. It will go for consultation at the beginning of March for 2 months, and we hope to publish by the middle of the year.